Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Free Friday webinar. It's good to see people are still doing webinars in afternoons with a lot of sunshine. So this webinar, as always, is automatically captioned, and you can use the closed caption button in Zoom, CC button. The webinar is recorded and will be published on our website and also the YouTube channel after the webinar, and everyone with registration will get a link to the recording afterwards. Your microphone is muted to avoid any background noise, and we will have a short presentation followed by Q&A. And please use the Q&A function to post questions to the speaker. There is a risk that we will miss them if you put them in the chat, but the chat is, of course, monitored for any technical issues, and you may also share links and so on in the chat. Maybe we can have the next slide. I don't have control over it. Yes. So today we are going to listen to our dear colleague Peter Kevin, who is going to talk about accessibility in public procurement. This is one of the most important topics, I think, that can really make or break accessibility, and still in 2026 we are still talking about it since many years, but now there is also a new technical report that supports this a little bit better. So who could do this better than Peter? Please let us know. Signed, sealed, accessible. What are you wanting to share with us today?
Hello, thank you very much, Susanna, and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Peter Kevin. I'm an accessibility specialist at the Funka Foundation, and I have recently been also the lead expert of the ACC ICT expert group. Goal of this expert group was to create a guidance update, a guidance about using accessibility requirements in public procurement in Europe for ICT. And that guidance is published, and at the end of this webinar, I will share the link with you. I will talk about public procurement in general. I mean, accessibility in public procurement in general, but I will also share some of the findings of creating what we had while creating this guidance. I had two very nice and knowledgeable experts doing the work with me. So let's dive in. But before that, I would go back a bit in time and talk about what I did before I was working with accessibility. I was actually working in a Hungarian Ministry of Infrastructure, and I was working with public procurement. And I was there and involved when the new accessibility directive was adopted. Around that, I was involved in commenting on it and reviewing it in the ministry. And I remember that I didn't deal with accessibility at that time. I didn't focus on accessibility in public procurement, and I didn't actually realize that in the 2014 public procurement directive, there was a huge and very accessibility friendly change, because before that the requirement or the law said, so the directive and also the national implementations, that whenever it's possible, the accessibility should be considered in public procurement. But in 2014, that became a legal requirement for all procurement, which is intended for use by natural persons, says the directive. So basically nearly all the procurements, because nearly all of them end up with a product, service, or work that is used by some of us. The procurement has to consider and require accessibility, except when duly justified, and that kind of caveat is very frequent in laws. But in general, it still means that when a public body procures something in a public procurement process, then they have to go for accessible. And there's another thing that changed slightly, but became very important in procuring accessible, is that the decision to choosing the winning tender don't need to be done based on only the price and or the cost, and that was there before, but having the possibility to choose the best tender based on the best price and quality ratio gives the opportunity for the contracting authority to make the bidders actually compete on accessibility and assess and reward if somebody is offering a more accessible solution. So that's the accessibility of the purchase or the procurement, the procured goods, services, and works. There's another aspect I would like to just very shortly mention as well, is the accessibility of the process, the public procurement process itself. The new accessibility directive does say that if it's an electronic process, then the electronic communication has to be accessible. So that at least is covered in part as well. Why do we talk about public procurement? Why is it so important? Because it's a great opportunity to scale accessibility. It has two very important effects if we consider accessibility in public procurement. One is that what is purchased will go to us, will go to the constituency, and it results in a more accessible environment. If a municipality is procuring only accessible buses, then after a while, all the buses in the municipal system would be accessible, and that would improve the quality of life of many people. The other thing is that it influences the market as well, because public sector has a huge purchasing power, and actually the suppliers and the manufacturers, they want to sell to public sector, so they have to make their products and services in general accessible to be able to to compete for contracts, for public contracts. So it's an important, very important aspect of accessibility. It's a very important venue. I would just very shortly go through the public procurement process in 5 steps to understand what we talk about. First step is the preparation. Here, the contracting authority has to decide what they actually want to buy, if it's an exact product or service, or it's a solution, how accessible it should be, and whether the market is ready for that product and service and for that level of accessibility. Then they have to translate that into the tender documentation and specifications, and there are 2 groups of requirements for accessibility. Some of them or most of them are obligatory. Sorry. So it means that all bidders have to comply with them in their bids. And there can be optional requirements as well, as I mentioned before. Then the contracting authority gets the offers, which they have to evaluate and make sure that they consider accessibility. Then comes the awarding, where if they wanted the bidders to compete on accessibility, they use this best price quality ratio criteria. And the last, it doesn't end there, so it doesn't end with signing the contract or awarding the contract. It's important that delivery makes sure, the contract and the delivery make sure that actually what will be delivered is accessible, and there are guarantees for the conformity there. So based on this process, I will enter into some of the steps and share a bit more details. First, technical specifications. Technical specifications is part of the tender documentation, and this describes the requirements that have to be fulfilled, not only for accessibility, but for any other technical details. For example, if I want to buy a table that's red, then that color should be set in the technical specifications. And of course, that whatever I buy has to be accessible. That's also part of the technical specification. As we saw, it's obligatory to require that. But what is the level of accessibility that has to be required? Actually, there are legal requirements for many products and services. and those requirements have to be asked for in the technical specifications. And as I mentioned, the contracting authority can decide to go beyond those minimum requirements and add additional requirements. So if the contracting authority asks for more accessibility than what is required in the law, then they can add it to the technical specifications. And it's a very important detail that that requirement or that level of accessibility has to be offered by the bid. If a bid doesn't fulfill these requirements, then it's out of the competition. How to do this, how to set the accessibility requirements? Well, if there's a law that sets it, then actually the contracting authority has to refer to that law. And since we have the European Accessibility Act and the national implementing laws of that, it makes it much easier to set the accessibility requirements, the accessibility level for at least those things that are in the Accessibility Act. And then there are also standards that talk about accessibility, and those standards can be also referenced in these technical specifications. But if we take the example of something in the European Accessibility Act, the contracting authority might want to buy something that has less accessibility aspects than all the criteria or requirements that are set in the law. So the contracting authority can make it easier for the bidders and for themselves when it comes to evaluating the bids to actually filter the applicable accessibility criteria. And for that, there are toolkits available online. One of them is the ETSI demo filter tool for the EN 301549 standard. That's the ICT accessibility standard. And it is downloadable from the website that shares the latest editorial draft for this standard. And my colleague Stefan will share the link to this document in the chat. And the guidance I mentioned actually has links for two other toolkits, one from Canada and one German toolkit. So I mentioned that you can refer to the European Accessibility Act directly, or you have to refer to the European Accessibility Act directly in your tender specifications if a product or service is in the scope of the European Accessibility Act. But this is a very versatile law, and it can be actually used beyond its scope. Because if a contracting authority wants to buy a website, for example, then it doesn't matter if that website is a website of a bank, which would be in the scope of the European Accessibility Act, or anything else. It's the same, it's a website, it has the same requirements. So the contracting authority can refer to the European Accessibility Act. And that can be extended to other products and services as well, which are similar or have similar functions than those in the European Accessibility Act. There's an important thing I want to mention about using the European Accessibility Act for products sold on the market and in public procurement, because the European Accessibility Act has some exclusions. For example, micro-enterprises don't need to follow the accessibility requirements for products. And there are transitional measures. For example, if there's an ATM already being used, then they don't have to be changed into accessible ATMs within a pretty long period of time. And that's okay for something sold directly on the market, but those exclusions and those transitional measures actually don't matter for public procurement, because if you remember, the requirement was to buy accessible. So it doesn't matter if the bidder is a micro enterprise or it's a big company. The important thing is that at the end of the public procurement, the thing that the contracting authority buys is accessible. So those exclusions and transitional matters don't matter. Beyond the legal requirement, the minimum requirements, and other requirements that are set in the technical specifications, the contracting authority can also say that, okay, I want to buy an accessible product, but I would prefer it to be more accessible than the minimum requirements or the requirements I set, and I make the bidders compete based on that. For that, they can put this aspect in the award criteria. They can set a higher level of accessibility that can be followed in the bid, and then the bid gets better evaluation, or they can open up the accessibility aspect in other ways. I will tell you some examples, but before that, I would really like to emphasize that whatever is the award criteria that relates to accessibility in this case, it has to be possible to evaluate the bids objectively based on that. So it cannot be that, oh, this I like more, it sounds more accessible. Or anything that's not objectively evaluatable, accessible, then that should not be involved as an award criteria. So what are the examples for award criteria for accessibility? It's either higher level of accessibility, so if the bidder offers more accessibility, then they get a better evaluation, a better assessment, and they are more probable to get the bid. It can be also the user involvement in the creation, in the development of products or in the provision of services, the involvement of persons with disabilities to make sure that the product or service is actually in real life accessible, or whether accessibility is in focus during the development, whether the testing is extensive or the bidder has training for its employees about accessibility or requires that the subcontractors have accessibility competencies. And then it comes to, you get the bid, or the contracting authority get the bid, and then they have to make sure that actually what is in the bid is in conformity with the accessibility requirements, both for the bids and also, of course, in the delivery. They have to make sure that what is delivered is accessible. There are different ways to assess conformity, and there are different documents, so to say. A product in the European Accessibility Act has to wear a label that shows that it fulfills the legal requirement, including accessibility. Service has to have a declaration published about that it fulfills the accessibility requirements. And then, of course, the bidder can have audits for their products or services that show that they are accessible. The very important thing in public procurement is who does this conformity assessment. And the suggestion in the guidance is that because public procurers often don't have the knowledge of or the resources to do this assessment, is that actually the bidders have to make sure that this accessibility assessment, conformity assessment is provided, and that they ensure that the product or service is accessible. But on the side of the contracting authority, the procurers have to have at least the knowledge to understand whether a conformity report is good enough or it's actually not showing accessibility. And then there are different aspects for that, whether it's a recent audit or it's an old one, whether the report is complete, both in the sense of covering all the accessibility requirements and covering all the parts of the service or the product. Then whether users were involved in the testing and what is actually the origin of a report like that, whether it's an independent auditing agency or it's done by the bidder, and in that case, whether the bidder actually can prove that they have experience or credentials relating to accessibility. And again, we're back to the last step of the procedure, which is after the public procurement itself, the contract performance. To make sure that the delivery is accessible, the contract has to include enforceable requirements. So it has to have requirements or details on how to remediate in case the delivery is not accessible. What if there are delays with the accessibility, or actually lacking accessibility should be treated the same way as a delay, and in those cases there are penalties as well. So basically, the contracts should use the same logic and requirements for accessibility as for any other non-compliance or delays. It can be holding back part of the payment until there's a positive user acceptance testing, or if there are accessibility issues found during that testing, that the contractor has to have the obligation to fix it within a certain number of days, or at least provide a timeline. There has to be conformance checkpoints all through the delivery, and of course, the final delivery should be checked for accessibility. To sum it up, I would say these are the 5 steps on the road to success. First, consider the user needs so that the product, service, or work both is accessible for as many users as possible. Then translate those into accessibility requirements in the public procurement process, in the documentation. Make sure that conformance assessment is set. Make sure that the requirements are part of the contract and that you check the compliance of the delivery. This is both for contracting authority actually, and many of these are also relevant for bidders. These and more details are included in the guidance I mentioned before, which you can download using this QR code, but also there will be a link shared in the chat. And the guidance is officially called Technical Report 101551 version 2, and it helps stakeholders, both contracting authorities and bidders and others involved, to understand the legislation related to the accessibility in public procurement, to use the standards to ensure the conformity with the accessibility requirements. And in its annex, it has some practical use cases that try to cover the different aspects, and for example, whether the product is existing, is on the shelf, or it's actually a solution that has to be developed in the public procurement process, and then what to do that the contracting authority has the right accessibility requirements that ensure accessibility of the product. And now I'm open to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Peter. That was a lot of information in very short time, but this is I know this is a topic you can talk about for hours. So thank you for doing it in 20 minutes. So I just wanted to add that you said something like the standards that you talked about can also be referenced in the technical specifications. I think we would recommend people to use the standards that we're working so hard with. So, but anyway, that's just my personal view. So we have the first question here is how can we use the Act outside of the EU? I didn't understand that part. Can you please explain?
It's not outside of the EU, but it's using the Accessibility Act for products and services that are actually not in the scope. So for something that's in the scope, let's say a computer, a personal computer, if a public authority buys 1,000 computers, then they can refer to the Act and say that the accessibility requirements in the European Accessibility Act have to be followed. But if they buy something that's actually not in the Act, but the requirements in the EAA can be relevant, they can still use the EAA as a reference for the requirements. And why is it good? Because it ensures that the contracting authority has the right requirements, which are already recognized in European legislation.
Which also makes it easier for the bidder because they would have seen the same requirements before. So it really it goes both ways. But thank you for that clarification. And we had this is maybe not so easy, but it was said that procurement is important for accessibility, and we can all agree on that. So why doesn't it work still after so many years and increased legal requirements?
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, it's a very good question. So that's one of the reasons this guidance was renewed. So it would provide help. What we've heard many times when we prepare this guidance is that the market is not ready, and public procurers don't have enough resources, and they are very much afraid that they don't get accessible bids. And that's a reality. So for that, the suggestion, it has to be something that that contracting authorities work on with awareness raising, with actually sending out prior notices about future public procurements to prepare the market. And the problem is that that's why I underlined many times that it has to be very well included in the contract. It's a slow transformation, I think, for going for accessible, but it is a legal requirement. Now we have the European Accessibility Act that is supporting it very strongly, and I hope that this scene will change in the close future.
Yeah, I also don't know why, but I think what we see often by clients is that kind of the communication people or maybe the IT people, they know accessibility, they know that they are supposed to do this, they want to do it when they procure, but then the procurers, they are sitting in another building or that's a completely different department and they speak some kind of legal language that, so they don't really communicate. And I think that sometimes creates a problem. So even if the organization as such wants to do the right thing and tries to do the right thing, there's some kind of mismatch or miscommunication. I don't know. And we can also see it. I mean, I've been working on the EN 301549 since it started in 2004, and we have always had issues having. I mean, it was firstly written to support procurement in the first round, and we had severe problems in getting procurers on board in the standardization work. So that says something about the complete lack of awareness. And so we all need to, if everyone here listening can reach out to a procurer, become their friend and, get them on board with accessibility, I think that will step by step help us moving forward. So I think we need to move on. Maybe we can have a quick one if this is a quick one. What minimum standards can we apply in procurement in the UK not covered by EAA? Well, you can still apply standards even if they are not legally required. So everyone is welcome to use the EN.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I think that actually the EN has the UK version, because in national legislation, national procurement, you cannot, or well, anywhere in national, you cannot use directly the European standard. You have to use the national standard. So each usually or ideally each member states have their own standard, which is the same often as which is the same as the European standard. And I think that in the UK that would probably be there as well.
Yes, because it was kind of attached to the web accessibility,
exactly.
which was transposed before Brexit. So that should be there. Okay, so we have just 2 minutes. So thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for the good questions. There are a lot of more questions. As always, we don't have time for all of them, unfortunately. But if you want to know more about our research and assignments and all the exciting things we do, please do subscribe to our newsletter. We will share a link and also the QR code. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, where we try to keep you updated with what we are doing. We are currently recruiting, so there may be interesting things going on there. And what else? Do we have another slide, or is not a good slide?
An accident.
This is better. So next Friday, because of the holiday season here in the spring, we had Easter for 2 weeks in different parts of Europe, and then we have what I call the Jesus flying. That's not the real word, and we have the Labor Day, and so there's a lot of holidays, meaning that the whole Friday, every second Friday becomes a little bit mixed up. So we will actually have another webinar already next Friday on the 24th, where it seems to be me speaking on the requirements for documentation based on the European Accessibility Act. So prepare your questions. So I have exciting questions to respond to also next Friday. And now we want to thank everyone who has been attending today. And please do remember to make something accessible before you close your computer for the weekend. Enjoy the sunshine and have a very good weekend. Bye-bye, everyone.
Have a nice weekend, and thank you for coming. Bye.